Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Julia and I discuss an article from Claudia Marroquin, the Dean of Admissions at Bowdoin College, that appeared in the Bowdoin Orient, their school newspaper, entitled Dean of Admissions Claudia Marroquin on the decline of male applicants to Bowdoin. I touch on a few things from the SACAC conference. I read a very moving letter that a listener sent in. For a question from a listener, Julie and I discuss a question from Clare from Virginia. She wants to know how colleges will evaluate a special program that is offered at her students' high school when they read the transcript. For our interview, we interviewed Lydia Dagenais on the topic, how does law school admissions work? And that'll be part 1 of 2. And for our college spotlight, we're going to the capital of Scotland, the University of Edinburgh. And Kevin Newton, our international specialist, will be our guest. That's also part 1 of 2. But friends, before we get started today, I have to give a huge shout out to Lisa and Linda. They presented a workshop at the SACAC conference entitled Creating Calm in the Chaos, subtitled Managing Parent Anxiety Throughout College Counseling Processes. Now, I'm hearing so many good things about their presentation, and they told me, you better not walk in there and make us nervous, so I couldn't attend, but I had to ask everybody. But before I even got to asking everybody, people came up to me, and they were saying these stupendous things. Now, you have to understand, there were 500 admission officers and 500 college counselors, the most ever at SACAC. And SACAC's been around since the early 90s. And there are multiple workshops every day, and there are 15 choices in every block. So you're talking about over 100 workshops at this conferences. And here's what one of Susan's friends said about Lisa and Linda's workshop. Linda and Lisa gave the best workshop at SACAC. Rave reviews, standing room only. So a lot of work goes into this, and one reason I'm mentioning it, partly because I'm proud of our team, but also just maybe we can get them to do a parent version as a webinar sometime in the next 12 months. Hint, hint, hint. Now, I had a blast. I've been here 6 days. I'm leaving in about 30 minutes. Next stop, Spartanburg, South Carolina. But I want to share a lot of what I learned at this conference and in college visits I've been doing here for the last 6 days. I'm going to share most of it on Monday episodes over the next 2 to 3 weeks. But before we start today, I do want to share one thing. So just earlier this morning, Brown University announced that in regular admission, they admitted 3.7%. Okay, now when you break that down as a fraction, that's 1 in 27. So 1 in 27 of the most outstanding applicants around the world got into Brown. Now, maybe it's possible your student got into Brown. I don't know. Somebody gets in. Every year people get in. But the chances are they are not going to get in. Now, I once used an example of the weather, and I'm going to do that again. If you turned on the forecast and you saw that there was a 3.7% chance that it's not going to rain, and you decide, I'm going to take my chances. I'm going to walk out without an umbrella. and you get drenched on, you should not be surprised that it rained. You were told there was a 96.3% chance it was going to rain. So there's a 96.3% chance that your student, if they applied to Brown, is not going to get in. And decisions are going to be out in the next couple of days, maybe even after you hear this, depending on when you hear it. And guess what? It's even harder for Stanford and Harvard and Princeton and Yale and some of those other schools. So I'm only saying this not to be negative, but just I've learned from a mental health standpoint, it's best for you to put yourself in the mindset, if you apply to one of those schools, that my student's probably not going to get in and not to expect it. And then if you get what you weren't expecting, it's a lot easier to handle. And if you get good news, trust me, you'll be able to adjust. So it's just my admissions tip for today. If you're applying to one of these uber selective schools and even moderately selective schools, just put yourself in the mindset that, student, I'm probably not getting in. Parent, my student's probably not getting in. It'll be a lot easier to handle.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
So this is a topic Julie and I have actually discussed. We've discussed it a few times on the podcast, and it is the gender issue that so many schools are experiencing when it comes to college admissions. And it's an article that appeared in the Bowdoin Orient, and I have to thank one of our listeners for sending it in. And thank you, listeners. You guys are awesome. We get a lot of content from information that you send us. And so what I really liked about it was Nikki Harris, who's the staff writer. I thought she really asked great questions. The title of the article says, Dean of Admissions, Claudia, is it Marroquin? Is that how you pronounce it, Julia? Do you know her? Is it Marroquin? I don't know her. Marroquin. Okay. Claudia Marroquin. Thanks for correcting me.
If you want to.
Thank you for correcting me. Dean of Admissions, Claudia Marroquin, on the decline of male applicants to Bowdoin. And I really liked it because I thought it was great questions that were asked by the staff writer. But, this is something that people can only have so much transparency on. They have to be a little careful on this topic. And I thought that, Claudia, I thought that she was pretty transparent compared to how a lot of people are.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been since 2006, when you go all the way back to an op-ed that was in the New York Times, an opinion column that was called To All the Girls I've Rejected by Jennifer Delonte Britz, who was the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Kenyon at the time, that I've seen somebody just come forward so publicly and just have this kind of conversation. And so what I'm going to do is go through and share a lot of the highlights from the article. It's kind of in question and answer format, and then let Julia comment on it. So it starts out by saying, Claudia Marroquin sat down with the Orient to discuss the widening gap between male and female applicants at Bowdoin. Senior Vice President, Dean of Admissions and Student Aid. She's a graduate of 06 from Bowdoin. She leads the admission office, and she says one topic that frequently comes up when she talks to her counterparts at other liberal arts colleges is, why aren't more men applying? And then they give the stats. In 2021 at Bowdoin, there were 4,027 men, 5,298 women, so almost 1,200 more. Actually, almost 1,300 more women in the applicant pool. Quote from her, I'm constantly on the phone with deans and other institutions. This was a topic of conversation after we released our decisions. Just figuring out what that gender parity or imbalance was, she told the Orient. It's not just us. It's a common topic at conferences. So then she goes on to say, while the college does its best to cultivate a balanced class, controlling for yield can only go so far. Still, she said, the college regularly presses to counter pressures that, if unchecked, would lead to far more women than men attending an institution that was once all male. And it shows the acceptance rate, 9.86 for men, 8.02 for women. All right, so then here are the questions, and I thought they were really great that Nikki Harris ended up asking to Claudia Marroquin. All right, so first question. You've touched on this already a little bit in Bowdoin Magazine, but I'm curious, why do you think so many fewer men are applying? I think there's a lot of different factors at play. I think more than anything, it's some of the societal pressures that men have to go into the workforce early, especially when you think of different subgroups of first-generation college men or those who come from different immigrant backgrounds. There's a pressure to go and start earning money earlier. So you definitely get so you saw that definitely exacerbated during the pandemic, and it hasn't recovered since the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, I mean, Jennifer Delonte wrote her thing in 2006, women far outpaced men in the applicant pools. So there's some societal factors and some that are really unexplained. And I think it does baffle everyone, not just us. All right. So then the next question was, so the pandemic exacerbated the gap between men and women? Yes. As you know, this trend is happening in every industrialized country, and it's happening with men of all academic backgrounds. Do you know why this might be? And then her response was, no, not necessarily. I mean, across the spectrum, there's always discussion of maturity levels are different for men and women. And I think in subgroups of men that might be from wealthier backgrounds, I think there's always a larger question on the return of investment in education. And that has been something that's been questioned more over the years. And with some fields offering micro-credentials where folks go right into the workforce, I think the tech industry is a perfect example of where you may not need a college degree anymore and you can do certification courses that sometimes seem attractive. So it's tough to pinpoint because I think, again, there's so many different subsections of men. So what happens next is Nikki Harris asks Claudia a question about a particular recruiting marketing piece that Bowdoin was running. So she says, you said in your interview with Bowdoin Magazine that Bowdoin has been doing recruitment efforts, going to schools with higher male enrollment. There's a Reddit post from 6 years ago that shows a pamphlet from Bowdoin to a prospective male applicant saying, your son is less likely to open emails. Can you tell me more about these recruitment efforts and why you guys do them? Click here to learn more. So she says, I think part of it is we've all been in a school that has tried to have parity in our gender enrollments. And part of it is because we're a liberal arts college. We're trying to have representation from all backgrounds. Over the years, we've tried a number of things, and we're still doing those things. We visit schools that might be all male. We try to encourage young men to attend college, especially liberal arts. We haven't done something as specific as the postcard you referenced recently. But as we look at our prospective applicant pool, we certainly do try to purchase the names of high-achieving boys and try to send a message to them earlier in the process, just trying to build our funnel. We talked about the admissions funnel before, as much as we can. Then she says there are many different sources that allow us to build our base. And she mentions College Board ACT, Niche, and College Greenlight as examples. We're always working to ensure we're reaching as many prospective students as possible, especially those for whom Bowdoin might be on the radar. High-achieving boys are certainly among this group. And then she goes on to say, patterns have shifted, so the message to students earlier in high school years where possible is important to encourage college-going behaviors. So the article actually shows the message that was on Reddit. It says, your son is spending a lot of time looking at this photo. You knew this. And then it says, one thing he's not, and not is in bold, doing is opening emails from colleges. And it says, data shows high-achieving boys like yours apply to fewer colleges than female classmates. They ignore emails and they get less mail. They start making lists later and often settle for the passive least resistance. Sound familiar? Then it says, please tell your smart, capable, busy son to open his college emails, and there's a link. So it kind of shows some of the kind of things that people were doing. And then they say, do you still send out that pamphlet? She says, no, not that pamphlet. That was an experiential pamphlet. Like anything, we got some feedback and some not so great feedback on that one. But we've ended up using some of our other messaging that is across the board sent to students of different backgrounds. And then Nikki Harris asks, can you talk about why it's important to have gender parity at a liberal arts school anyway? And she says, I just think it's been an institutional priority over the years to have balance, whether that ends up being 60-40, however you define it. I think there's flexibility and it will ebb and wane. but we're a school that thinks about putting leaders into society. You want to make sure that they're also male leaders with female leaders. So it's one of those things the college has just looked at very carefully. And then she also goes on to say a number of other schools have started to really shift. Early this fall, there's an article in Tulane showing that it was 70-30 women. So I don't know where it necessarily will get to that point quickly, but it's interesting to see what the future holds. So then Nikki says, how do you guys balance creating fairness for women in the application process? And she says, I think that's the toughest question. A lot of the admission process may not seem fair to folks. And that's where it's complicated, because it's about a number of different levers and priorities and how we're trying to build a class and community. And some people believe that it should always be fair and formulaic, and that students should always be able to understand why they got in or didn't get in. That's never going to happen, especially at a selective institution. So I think at the end of the day, we've built a community we're proud of here, and one where every student has earned their place here. All right, Julia, we're about halfway through this article, but I'm tired of hearing the sound of my voice. I want to hear what's brimming around in that brilliant mind of yours over there. What are your thoughts so far of anything we've said?
So this is something we talked about even when I worked at Haverford, over 12 years ago. It's definitely really common in small liberal arts colleges. And it is true that women are overrepresented in terms of applicant numbers. And the question of how is this fair is a tough one. Admissions isn't necessarily fair. What I would also say, though, is it's not that and this is also the danger that some opponents of affirmative action also use, which is that, are you now preferencing less qualified people over more qualified people? Especially in a place like Bowdoin or most colleges, that's not the question. It's not like, oh gosh, we got to kick out a few girls so you can take some of these mediocre guys here. It's that there's so many applicants that are, quote, qualified. And I would even argue that's not even what's on the mind of most of these admission officers, is that most applicants are qualified regardless of where you're coming from or your identity. And so it's more about space and ensuring a community that works to serve the mission of your college. So just like where any other sort of background or demographic feature is overrepresented, that's something a college has to think about. There's an overrepresentation of people applying from New England to Bowdoin. There's an overrepresentation of white students applying to Bowdoin. Maybe too many independent school students, right? So these are all things. It's not saying that you're choosing someone less qualified over that. It's just that in an effort to really achieve gender parity or true diversity, is that you're going to have to maybe think about what the demographic pulls are and pressures are to ensure that you've really enrolled a diverse class that meets the mission of the school. That being said, most of these schools are still most of the small liberal arts schools still do hover around a 55-45 split. So they do have more women on campus. So it's not like, where have all the women gone? So that's a tough question, but something we definitely wrestled with at Haverford. And did I ever make a decision where I'm like, this stinks, that, I had to say no to this woman over a man? No. It would always be, this stinks, I have to say no to so many students, right? Regardless of their background. So I hear it can feel like, oh, it's so tough to be a woman applying to college. And yes, you might be overrepresented, but I'm not sure fairness is not being met here, or there's, folks who are, shouldn't have been admitted or getting admitted simply because of a demographic piece.
I think it's great you put it in that context of this actually applies to so many things, right? You could go on and on, even in state, out of state, all kinds of things. Like schools admit people according to their own institutional priorities, period. The other thing is, this is not just liberal arts. Like, do you know what UCLA is right now? 60-39.
Whoa.
Yes. Yeah. So it's like impacting, there's your big university with football and engineering. 60 there, and you're like, that adds up to 99, Mark. Well, of course it's 60 point something or 39 point something, right? And that's right off their website, by the way. They have a section on their website, facts and figures. And yes, they are 39% male. So it's impacting everybody. Every school is different. But if you have a daughter and you were looking at selective schools, this is something you need to be aware of, especially if you're building your own college list. I'll share a story with a student I worked with this year. The student was thinking about applying early decision to Tulane in ED2. And when she found out that Tulane is basically 2/3 women, she changed their mind, and she is not applying ED2 to Tulane anymore. So the reason why I share that story is because if you admit too many women, then you have a woman problem because they don't want a school that's 70-30. In fact, one of the families I worked with this year, Julia, they felt so strongly. In fact, they recommended a book that I really need to read because they made it sound so amazing. But the book basically talked about when a campus gets too far on the women's side percentage, then it's not healthy as far like that male female ratio produces this entitlement. It leads to hookup culture, like all kinds of things kind of come with that. And so if it was more than 55-45, they were out. They really wanted 52-48, which was really hard to get. And they had to like make some sacrifices on that. But the point is, this is all coming from a mom.
Right.
Feeling this way.
Yes.
So while you might think, well, it's not fair to women, you're going to have a big problem with your young women if you get that skew too much in the other direction.
Oh, totally. And when I was at Vassar, it was more like a Tulane. But the difference being Vassar is a historically women's college.
Sure.
So it would make sense, right? I think they are now much closer to that 45-55, maybe even a little more for men. But when I was a tour guide there, that's the number one question I would get mostly. And it wasn't just from parents, but it would sort of be, how am I supposed to meet someone to date? And I will be honest with you, I don't think it's like this anymore, but actually a lot of I won't reveal names, but a lot of my male heterosexual cisgender male friends actually felt so much pressure because the dating pool was a little small for heterosexual women. And so it did affect our quality of life. I loved it. It was definitely for me. I liked the fact that women were always in leadership positions. We actually, it was probably the only place I've ever felt where women were as the majority and also the centered gender. But I know that my male counterparts and some of my female counterparts really didn't, that wasn't for them. That wasn't what they were looking for. And no, you're not at college to get your MRS degree, as I used to say to those students and families, but that if this is a really big thing that you're thinking about and part of what you're looking for in college, maybe you do need to pay attention to that. And I'm sure there are many students who decided not to come because they didn't like the gender breakdown and they could get a different gender breakdown at a really similar school.
Yeah, so I'll just touch on a few more questions that Nikki Harris asked Claudia Marroquin, who I came to realize Julia's met, so she knows the person we're talking. What, have you guys traveled together or just through your placement and stuff?
Always circling around each other. And Claudia used to do College Horizons as well. So yeah, she's been such a great steady presence for Bowdoin since a long time.
Well, I'm just appreciative when someone has some candor because she says things here that other people wouldn't say because they wouldn't want the arrows coming at their back. All right. So in the interview, Nikki Harris asked, are female applicants better qualified than men? And Claudine says, that's a tough question. I think when we see the subsection of students who apply, they're really all top applicants across the board. So basically, she said the same thing Julia said, like everybody is academically qualified. So I'm not going to go so far as to say people are more academically qualified. It was really how she answered that. And she said it's really hard to quantify in an average versus a not average. So I mean, that's tough because what metrics are you using when you say qualified? Like there's always an aspect of if you're bringing something to the campus that they don't have as much of a presence of, that significantly adds to your qualifications if you're looking at things holistically, right? Then she says, Nikki says, are there any peer institutions that you think are handling this well? And Claudine says, no, not necessarily. I think that's an issue we're all grappling with and we're trying to figure out. I'm constantly on the phone with other institutions, and it's gotten worse since the pandemic. She talks about how they travel as a 6-college group with other liberal arts colleges. It's a constant topic of conversation about figuring out this gender parity piece. And then she says Pomona, who's in that 6th group, had even a larger spread over the last few years as far as gender gap. And then the question comes up, I'm curious if you guys did choose to expand the gap and make it further from 50-50. What would that look like? And then she basically went on to say, I think this year, as we go through reading early decision applicants, we're keeping this top of mind to make sure we're building out the class the right way. The fine tuning will come in a little later. So right now, we're hoping to have close to 50-50, but we'll see, And we also want to have all 50 states. And she talks about other types of diversity. And then Nikki says, how does going for 50-50 by gender compare to the importance of recruiting a racially diverse and an economically diverse student body? And Claudine says, I think having a diverse student body is most important thing for us because all different viewpoints get expressed in a classroom. When we're looking at gender, it's important, but it wouldn't be as important, I would say, personally speaking, as having diversity across a broad spectrum. Now, if the numbers were like 80-20, 90-10, I'm sure she'd feel differently.
Right.
Probably implied in that is if we're 40 or 45, there's still enough representation there to have that view expressed.
Right.
Then the question comes up, do you share concerns with other admission officers, which were expressed in the New York Times piece, that gender imbalance makes a college less desirable to potential applicants? So this is what Julia and I were just talking about, right? So she says, I don't know if our applicants or prospective students are asking that. I think it's always top of mind for some students, but it doesn't necessarily always come up in a lot of conversations. What I see more and more students asking about diversity as a whole rather than just gender diversity. When it comes to gender, students want to make sure that it would be a safe space if they are questioning their own identity, but having an equal balance has not necessarily come up in conversations with prospective students, at least at Bowdoin. And then the question is asked, so if the imbalance started to grow, or if the admission office chose to expand its split, you guys wouldn't be super concerned about it making Bowdoin less attractive? And she says, I don't know that I'd go that far. It's hard to tell how students would react to a huge imbalance. The New York Times piece made it seem like it would be a concern. It should be a concern because there's a lot of opinions expressed that would become less desirable. I think at the end of the day, there's a desire for students to have a quality education and one where they go to interact with students with a multitude of identities. Then Nikki asks, does athletic recruitment help bring a greater number of men to Bowdoin? And Claudine says, there's an aspect of where athletic recruitment does help that. Obviously, we do have an equal number of athletic teams, and some large rosters like football, lacrosse, hockey do help in that. So there is that piece where it's part of the larger puzzle. And so those are the questions. Now, I will say this, Julia, you know this. There are schools that don't have those things, that don't have football, don't have hockey, don't have engineering, liberal arts. And I think those are probably schools have even a greater challenge than Bowdoin does.
I would agree. I hate, as a gender studies major, I hate doing these sort of like stereotypical
I know.
things,
I feel I'm torturing you over here.
No, but I see it like manifest, and certainly that last article we talked about where some schools have added football teams for that reason, and it has sort of yielded some higher numbers. But I think about my students, for example, and I would say, for my sort of cisgender, heterosexual male students, that really the only time I see a small liberal arts college added to their list is usually because they're a recruited athlete there. I don't know if it's a stereotype or they feel pressured to not choose a college like that and would much rather go to a mid-size or larger school where they have these more traditional school spirit metrics. I don't know if that's just like from in the womb and our social construction of gender, and that's how it all plays out. But a lot of the times, if my male students are not recruited athletes at a NESCAC like Bowdoin or a D3 program, then they'll just give up on small liberal arts and also look at, now for whatever reason, they still love Tulane despite that imbalance. But maybe that's because there's some more markers there where they feel like, I don't know, they can find
Yeah, but I think
themselves
that's different because Tulane still plays on ESPN and, you know.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Those sort of markers where it doesn't feel. And then I also want to add, as much as, and maybe this is not directed at Bowdoin, but yes, a lot of the Bowdoin's peer institutions do have a women's team counterpart or equal numbers, but the recruitment process does not work like that. Male sports are far more supported by the admission office in the college. And so you do actually end up bringing in potentially more men that way. You know, a football coach at a NESCAC is going to get more leniency and freedom when they build their roster than a women's track coach, for example, or even field hockey. And it does depend on the school maybe and what sort of their strengths of their program are. But I definitely do see that playing out in the athletic recruitment realm.
I'll tell you a couple observations I have. And one of them is, it's just, I don't have any data, but it's something I feel. And the other one is one I hear a lot. And it was also in the article. All male schools are getting so many college visitors as part of their recruitment. Like I'll talk to a student, I'll talk to a counselor at an all male school versus a women's only school. I'm talking about K-12 or high schools.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very noticeable how many more college admissions officers target these all male schools in their recruitment. The other thing, and this is weird, but I'm noticing this. I feel like people are putting more of an emphasis on big time sports than they did before and wanting that whole experience.
Yes.
And like in some ways it's weird for me because I was that person
right
40 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I was heavily influenced by Magic Johnson and all and like the big buzz and going to the game. Like that was, but I was a total sports person. So that was me 40 years ago. But I noticed more and more students comment on this. It's a priority for them. And also, if you look, Julia, at the TV ratings right now for like the NFL, they're through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Big time live sports. Now, some of it is that you can DVR everything else and watch it on your own time. And guess with the game, you really can't because every time I do it, but every single time I try to do it, somehow, some way, somebody comes in and says the score of the game. And then it blows it for me because half the fun is the suspense. So now that I know who won, I can't even want to watch it, you know. But do you sense that? Like, I feel more people are wanting the whole everything about that. Like, it just looks like fun. And it's always been there. So it's not something that wasn't around before. But if I was to take all the families I work with, the percentage of them for whom this is important is more than it used to be. Do you, any thoughts?
Totally agree with you. And I also see that as a huge part of the influx of my students wanting to go to large Southern schools as well, or state schools in the South, Southeast particularly. Whereas like the amount of Clemson apps I have now is like, or even like University of Tennessee. Like I went back in my archive.
That was never on your radar before.
Never.
Like,
and then I had 2 students applying. It's the first choice of a student I have now. Like,
yes.
So I don't, and so it's encouraging actually to hear you talk about that too, because sometimes I'm like, it's a New England boarding school. Maybe they are looking for sort of that. But I really would think social media has a lot to do with this. Certainly with rushing, fraternities, sororities, Greek life, definitely TikToks of football programs, things like that. So I do think social media has sort of, whether we meant to or not, assigned some meaning in terms of what might be your experience at these schools. And I think a lot of people are seeing themselves in those.
Well, we can put this to the test because I have an interview coming up with Fabrizio's over the University of Tennessee admission office. And the topic of the interview is how did Tennessee go from 17,000 apps a decade ago to 51,000 10 years later? How did that happen? On my visit to Tennessee in June, he specifically gave me 6 reasons. And so when I was like, ooh, this is good, our listeners would want to hear it. Will you come on the pod? He said, sure. So we'll talk to him specifically about that. But you're right. I see way more Tennessee, way more Clemson. I just made a statement before, had more Clemson the last 2 years than the previous 20. Georgia's definitely up. This is a lot of schools that actually applies to. And it can be a little trendy sometimes when someone starts winning. You can actually see it. I have a feeling Michigan's going to be tougher next year than it was this year. But, it's all part of, it's weird to me, though, because sometimes, Julia, I don't always see a correlation. Like, I don't see as much correlation with Ohio State and Alabama as I would think I would. Sometimes I think it's the combination of sports and where your family vacations, where they travel, that kind of builds a comfort level. I don't know. I'm just talking out loud and speculating. Anyway, we're getting off topic. But the point is, is there anything you can think of that can be done about this gender issue, or it is just kind of is what it is? Just like recruiting natives, it's going to be tough.
I don't know. To me, it's such a cultural thing and a social thing. It's not just a higher ed thing. You think about job market, like there are definitely, including our profession, Mark, where there is a huge overrepresentation of cisgender women. So I think it's just in the water. I mean, technically, 51% of the human race is women. So already you got a little bit more there, but
that's minor.
Yeah. But also it's, it's sort of the upsetting part of this is that women are mostly, but still underrepresented in so many places, even though they might be overrepresented in so many pools. So in some ways, I think keeping the gender imbalance a little bit in the favor of women is actually somewhat helpful.
That's actually a good point, because there's still a major glass ceiling problem in society. And if you're going to start kicking down that door, part of it helps. One thing that helps is having a bigger pipeline coming out. Of course, that's not the only thing that has to happen. And that's why I get that this can really, really be frustrating, especially, to a lot of women. Like, okay, it's harder to get in, and then men still have the advantage with who's represented in the C-suites and the higher end positions in the job world. Like something just doesn't settle right with me with this picture. But anyway, we'll continue to keep talking about all the pressing hot issues in admissions. I thought this was a good article because I really can't think back since 2006 when that article came out in Kenyon, the opinion piece in the New York Times. I've never heard an admission director be so forthright and so public and so candid about this topic as this article. And I thought it was worth us bringing to you guys. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Mark.
Friends, as I've mentioned, I've been in the Research Triangle the last 6 days, and I've been attending the conference. I've been doing college visits, and I'm going to be sharing a lot of what I've learned with you over the next few Mondays. But I want to share one of the things now. The thing about a conference like this is, at least this one, even if the workshops were great, 75% of my learning was networking. I'm a big networker. Sometimes it's more formal over lunches and breakfasts. A lot of times it's just these 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes casual conversations you have with admission leaders. And several themes kept coming up over and over and over again in my conversations as well as in workshops. Certainly one of the themes is the enrollment cliff, the demographic cliff, and the tsunami that's about to hit us. In fact, I'll give you a big number. And this came from, I attended a presentation that Gil Villanueva did. And, from Rhodes, 574,000 less college students expected. How's that for a number? Jeff Schiff, then, who was over Tulane's office for many, many years. He was at Tulane for 17 years. He did a presentation and he came out and said, It's time for us to face the fact that we don't have enough colleges in America for the number of students. So that was certainly one of the big themes. Another was the impact of AI. Certainly we heard that over and over and over again. But one of the things that we heard as much as anything there was the dearth of boys, the gap between the girl-boy pool, and colleges just flummoxed, befuddled, not knowing what to do about it and how to handle that. It just came up over and over and over again. Now, a lot of times when we have this conversation about the dearth of boys, I feel a lot of times we put it in the context of what's wrong with those boys? Why can't they get their act together? It reminds me, when I was in college, one thing that I enjoyed doing is studying urban areas. In fact, my favorite class I ever had in undergrad was called the ghetto, how ghettos are formed, and the powerful forces that come together to form ghettos. But I think a lot of times when people see ghettos, they say, what's wrong with these people? Why can't they get their act together? Slavery ended 160 years ago. I kind of feel that's almost the mindset with boys that we have. Like, what's wrong with those people, that gender? They need to get their act together. Well, our listener sent in a really powerful email and asked her if I could read it. It's a faithful listener who doesn't miss an episode, part of our listening family. It's one of the more profound emails that I've read, and I was really happy when she said I could read it. I think it's important because it takes a different angle than the what's wrong with boys or what's wrong with conservatives. And this is why diversity is so important. It's so important we hear from people in their own words and not some caricature of what we think other people believe. So here it is. I'm reading it to you. Hi, Mark. Hope all is well with you. I had a crazy conversation with my hairstylist. Her son started at the University of Cincinnati last fall. She told me she got to spend a weekend with him, just the two of them, recently. I thought, oh, that's nice. However, it didn't go well. Her son explained that college has been so enlightening that he had to reprogram himself from all the things he learned growing up. Furthermore, he said, no offense, but if we, talking about me and you, Mom, weren't related, I wouldn't even associate with you, Mom. Then he went on to say things like, people who drive pickup trucks are evil. This is a working class, rural, small town, 15,000 population family. When colleges are wondering where the boys are, when colleges are questioning why conservatives stop seeing the value of sending their kids to college, this is why. In just 4 months, that kid came to reject his roots and his family as if they were immoral. There's nothing special about these people. They aren't alt-right extremists. They aren't fundamentalist Christians. They are just folks. Heck, his mom has vibrant blue and green hair. So when farmers and trade workers, people who tend to drive trucks, see their kids returning from college full of disdain for their own parents and the people who feed, build, and supply the nation, it's no wonder they are losing confidence in higher education. If the culture on campus that's there teaches there's only one way to think, then it isn't education, it's indoctrination. If nuanced discussions aren't allowed, then what is? I don't know if you've already recorded your interview with Julia about the changing gender demographics of college students, but this issue needs to be part of the discussion. The echo chambers of discourse are further dividing our country. One of the things I love about YCBK is that you all encourage diversity of thought and opinions. Sorry if this is rough. I'm at work and I wanted to get it to you ASAP. But I'm guessing none of this is news to you, but it hit me hard to hear what happened to my stylist. I think we all really, really need to think hard about that and how that pertains to diversity of perspective on college campuses.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Julia, we've got a great question from Clare from Virginia. I'm going to play the question and get your thoughts. What do you think?
Hi, Mark. I'm Claire from Virginia, a longtime listener, and have a question on an academic program our high school offers. They call it the Distinguished Scholars Program, and it's an optional track in a student-selected area of focus. The areas can be in STEM, humanities, or the fine arts. The student must take 3 classes in their selected area, none of which can be required for a graduation class, and one of which must be at the AP level. They also have to research, draft, and defend a scholarly capstone paper, along with completing an internship in their selected area. My question to you is there any value in your student participating? Are these programs becoming a thing? And lastly, if your student opts out, would colleges see this as not rising to a rigorous opportunity? Looking forward to your thoughts on this. Thank you, Mark, and everyone else at YCBK.
I think my answer will be a little unhelpful, Claire. I'm really sorry, because it does really depend on the high school. I have read hundreds of high schools as an application reader where it's not super common, but yes, some really great public schools or well-resourced public schools or not even actually. And then some independent schools do have these sort of tracks or diplomas or special programs that just sort of give a student an acknowledgement in a special area of work. And it can really depend on the high school as to how that program or track is perceived by colleges. And I would imagine it might really depend on the college as well. So I really would hope that your guidance counselor at the high school or your college counselor at an independent school would be really honest with you about it should do 2 things. It should serve your child's interest, or if you're a student thinking about one of these tracks. I just read a school that's nearby me that has this really cool like STEAM diploma and then also like a global citizenship diploma. So a lot of the times the students who were interested in global citizenship were already kind of taking those courses. But that doesn't mean that that's maybe like the top student. So there's something to be said in specialization and having that. And I've worked for a college that cares a lot about that. And so they might really like to see that specialization. And I've worked for a college that would have preferred a student to have taken an AP course every time it was available rather than do one of these special tracks. So I think I would really try to ask 2 questions. One of the school, which would be like, where do the students who elect to take this track or this diploma, where might they end up in college, and look at sort of the swath of selectivity among those schools. And also, if it's very much in your wheelhouse or your interest, then that should serve you well. So I would really just try to ask those 2 questions to determine if it makes sense. In terms of if a student decides not to do one of those diplomas or tracks, and if the college cares about that, again, that would be really individual to the high school as well as the college, where some colleges might really appreciate that specialization and want to enroll students from that track or diploma. And or there might be some colleges or high schools rather that they offer it, but maybe it's not for their top students. And then colleges wouldn't necessarily be upset about that. But if it's advertised that the track or the diploma is not for their top students, there might be some highly rejective colleges out there that will say, well, cool that they have this program and this diploma, but if your top students aren't in there, we're not necessarily looking for that. But that's with a huge caveat. I don't know how you feel, Mark, but I think it really just depends on the high school, really honestly, the reputation of the high school. Not to say that you have to be known, but that if a college knows that the most curious and involved and engaged students are in that track, then that's really helpful. But other than that, I have a really hard time answering that question in a way that's helpful.
No, I think what you said was extremely helpful. And I'm just super proud of our team because both Julia and Susan also are reading applications as well. So they're doing counseling, reading. And I think it's so cool, Julia, that you were at a school that, that looked at this one way and another school that looked at it differently. So just for you to be able to bring that nuance into this conversation, I think that's so helpful. I have a couple thoughts. One is, first of all, the program sounds really neat. It really, really sounds neat. Like anytime you have these capstone type experiences where you can go deep into an area, like those can provide such a great opportunity for learning, especially if somebody picks an area of personal passion. And so I just think the program sounds pretty neat. That's the first thing I'd say. If you are going deep into an area that also lines up with the rest of your application, there's real potential to tell a story there. We call it your compelling narrative. Like this could maybe fit really nicely into whatever your compelling narrative is. So that's a thought. Another thought I had, and Julia was alluding to this as well, is a lot of times colleges will rely on the school counselor at the high school to put in context, like, one, how rigorous is this program? And kind of what Julia said, is this something like that the higher achievers tend to do? Or is this more of like maybe a default option that maybe people that aren't on the advanced track that they still do? But that's important to colleges. So I think so you could get a lot of information by talking to your school counselor and to see, like, is this something that is pursued by the students with the most rigor that are applying to the most selective schools, or is that not the case? Any thoughts you have on that, Julia, and the role that plays when a school counselor positions it in a rigorous light?
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark. Like, shout out to my friends at Brearley, which is a all young women's high school in New York City. They actually have a really cool track where there is some sort of specialization that results in an independent study and/or an internship. And the counselor letter was so helpful for me to understand that maybe not their valedictorian, if you will, always does this, but the fact that they would have really meaningful and rich experience. And I read some recs from some of those teachers and some of those internship mentors, and those students really popped for me in reading their application. And I will say this too, they were also really top students as well. But being able to read that counselor letter and learn about what the sort of responsibility and the weight of doing that program was, that the student had to forego some more traditional course selections. They had to forego an extracurricular commitment because of the internship or capstone component. So all of that, like you said, Mark, could actually really help distinguish an applicant at the end of the day, and not necessarily, even if it takes away in a traditional sense, it can make the student look a little shinier in some other ways.
Yeah, and I can't stress enough how important authenticity is to colleges. It's just so, so, so important. And they're so aware of how many things are contrived, how many things people do for resume building, whether it's their summer programs or the courses they take, and so to the extent to which it comes off very authentic, like what you decided to pursue feels really backed up in the rest of your application by your interests. And a really good way to do that is to have third-party substantiation. So if you have like your recommenders or an outside rec, other people speaking to your love of this area or the depth to which you went, like all of those things have a chance to really make it land well. I always think, I don't know how you feel about this, Julia, but I think it's harder to pop for a student that doesn't show sort of any strong interest in anything. I think it's a lot easier to get excited when someone shows, like, I'm working with a student right now from the Midwest, and she's from a very underrepresented state in the Midwest. and she's hardcore into plant genetic research. Hardcore.
What?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. She's also 4.0 and like top of her class. But I'm like, I actually met with them yesterday and I was like, she's really a strong applicant. Like, I think she's going to be really competitive in a lot of pools. Part of it is, I said, she may be the student that a school reads who is the most passionate applicant on plant genetics all year. And I mean, she's hardcore into it. Like, I can only think of one other student I've ever worked with that I think has this level of passion for like plant genetics. And so I just know that's going to land well because it's going to be everything she says is backed up by what she's done in summers, what she's involved in, what her teachers are going to say about her. Right. And it just really can look compelling. Now, does this mean she's getting in everywhere? Most likely not. It's really competitive out there in some applicant pools that she's in. But this is the kind of thing that can make an applicant pop or stand out in competitive pools. But schools are so different and they have different priorities, which often lead to different admission decisions. I mean, I think it's always tricky to talk about this because you can, there's that whole conversation of a well-rounded person versus a well-rounded class. Right. My experience with that is that a lot of times admission officers will say, we want both, which is true. But I think what they sometimes don't say, some do, some don't, is it can be harder to stand out if you're just sort of that jack of all trades in a really competitive pool. And I get what they're trying to do because they're also trying to reinforce authenticity. And they know as soon as I start saying to people that if somebody goes deep in an area and it's authentic, you have a chance at popping, we know we're going to get a whole bunch of people doing that, whether they're interested or not. So sometimes I find admission officers give a little more PC answer to that.
Yes.
Would you agree? You agree, Julia?
Yes.
And it's probably for the same reason, right? They don't want to encourage disingenuous behavior.
Right. Exactly. Yes. And I think it's, we just did course planning at Milton. And so I'm meeting a lot of students that I wouldn't interact with, right? As students who are 9th graders or 10th graders. And I had a bunch come in being like, oh, I hate Latin, but I heard like colleges love classics majors, so I'm just going to stick with it. And I was like, no. I was like, they love people who love classics, maybe. And I was like, but that'll be so obvious. I was like, if you're just taking it as your foreign language requirement, that'll be really obvious to them. Just taking Latin does not mean that you're in this like secret group of really, and maybe that might have been true 25 years ago, but it's just, you're so right, Mark. Like they really sniff it out. So yeah. I really think that if it matches up with the genuine interests of the student and it helps the student enhance those genuine interests, then it's likely a good call as long as it's not getting in the way of the student's overall picture, which again, I would just really rely on your school counselor for that information. And I would say on the other hand, unless the program is like the thing that only a very select group of the top students get into, electing not to do that, I don't think would be often read as bad from the college. Yeah.
The other thing that popped into my head on this question is we still can't divorce how this will be seen in the context of your broader transcript.
Right.
So they're still going to look at math, English, science, social studies, foreign language. And if it's a selective school, did you max out the curriculum or how far did you go? Like, just because a school has this really neat program with a capstone, that doesn't absolve somebody from having a soft curriculum in the rest of their program, right? So it's going to be all seen in the broader context of your whole entire transcript. And that's a huge thing because even if there's this neat thing here, it doesn't take up all 4 years. There's still plenty of time for you to buttress your candidacy by showing your rigor and your performance in that rigor. And once again, I also want to say, Julia and I are kind of talking here about very selective schools. And I want to make people think like so many kids in schools out there that are just happy to have a good solid 3L student. You know what I
Right.
mean? And they would think this is amazing. And so the sense I got, though, was that you were interested in sort of how it might land at more selective schools. So we're kind of approaching it from that standpoint. I don't want people to think that it's always tricky when we're talking, because we're talking to such a wide range of students and performances of students and students looking at different schools. And different selectivity levels of different schools is also a major factor. And so we always want to keep in context. Like it always freaks me out, Julie, when somebody says something like, oh, my student's scared they won't get in anywhere. And then I'm like, see, that's because of all of the hype of all the selective schools. Like
Right.
Julie and I know, like if we have a kid, we could have a kid that's like a 2.7 GPA and we put the 2.5. We can put together a list where that kid gets in all kinds of places. It even
Totally.
gets merit scholarship money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
So
yes.
please understand, if you're listening and you're not that, your student is not that kid, that you're not feeling like, well, there's no hope for me, because you're sitting here talking about maxing out the curriculum and all the solids and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
And you could still do that, and you could still not get into those very
Yes.
selective schools, right? So it's
Yeah.
not magic, but like you said, Mark, you just want to make sure everything kind of fits. Because I would say, probably in my limited experience, the most common pros that I will write in an application after reading a student who elected to do one of these sort of tracks or diplomas is I usually am like, bummer, they didn't opt for calculus because of the
Right.
program, or bummer, they didn't. So just really making sure, like you said, Mark, just weighing that overall sort of transcript that you're providing, along with what interests you and what maximizes your sort of academic and scholarship opportunities.
Yeah. And, not taking calculus is one of those things for a lot of highly selective schools that just deems your curriculum as not rigorous. It just still kind of is, for all the growth of statistics and all of that. And certainly it depends on the school, and selectivity and major can play some role in this. But, there are certain things like you see out there a lot. We talked about one the other day, only taking 2 years of a foreign language, is a common one. Julia, the schools that you were at, how did they see not taking physics, chem, and bio? Were you looked at a little differently if you didn't do physics, chem, and bio?
Totally. Yep. And both schools I've read for call it the science trinity.
Yep.
And even I use that parlance with my students, is that, and by the way, my listeners, and just because Jess Lord, my former dean of admission, would probably have my hide if he heard this. In high school, this person, I never took chemistry or physics.
Good thing Vassar didn't care.
So this just leads into, if people like to make fun of me for my my STEM background in college.
That just means you are a rock star in every other area to overcome that.
I applied at a very different time. My high school lost accreditation when I was a senior. We got it back. But I would say, yes, I think even the most, including my own college, Vassar College is one of a handful that doesn't actually have any requirements per se. But you will definitely need a background in that science trinity because you are likely to go to a college that will require something where you're taking a lab-based science at some point. So I would say that in the applications, including recently that I've read, it was I actually checked a box if the student did not complete the science trinity.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring that to our listeners' attention, because there's a few things like that. Did you do the science trinity? Did you get to calculus? You know what I mean? How far did you get in? Did you drop out early in four? And there's just a few things like you should just know. For more selective schools will immediately get you put into the non-competitive pool. And, you know, what I do for all of my students, because this conversation, what I'm doing all the time now is going over their course selection for the last 45 days. Some schools do it as early as January, some February, some March.
Yep.
And when it gets to this rigor, I like to pull up the NACAC State of College Admissions criteria that they use, the 2023 report, and I show them grades and rigor by far rank ahead of anything else as the two things that college admission officers say count the most in their admissions decisions. And I feel bad because so many high schools have graduation requirements that are not going to be rigorous enough for selective schools. And people get caught up into thinking, well, I just needed it for graduation. And this is where bad counseling can really sink your ship,
Right.
because colleges, that's not necessarily going to be seen as excusable.
I know. It breaks my heart. I was definitely that person in committee being like, oh, but like it wasn't their fault. They didn't know. And guess what? There's no space. There's no time. They're looking for reasons to deny you. So then someone's just going to look at me and be like, yep, that's sad, but that's the reality, right? Like,
Yeah, because the hard part is, even if you believe that, the question in more competitive pools, it becomes, okay, that's fine, but can we justify taking them over somebody who did all that and also has great personal qualities, good recs, evidence of making a difference? Like that's just the reality in these pools where, that are really selective. And so just anyway, we're going off on transcript and rigor, but I think we can't talk about that enough. That this, this decision, the question you're asking, will be seen in the broader context of all of these things.
right.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Julia. That was fun.
Thank you. Great question. Yeah.
Great question.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
All right. Well, it took us a half an hour, but we're going to transition to our main reason for having you on. But all that other stuff was amazing. And it's your law school admissions background. So we're in our 7th year now of your college-bound kid, effective February 1st, so year 7. We've never had an interview on law school admissions. So with your background, you're the perfect person for this. And so, I would love just for you to just start out and just talk about, how does law school admissions work?
Yes. Well, law school admissions is surprisingly similar, I think, to undergraduate admissions in terms of the things that you need, the pieces of the application. What is very interesting, what I was shocked by when I started working in law school admissions, is that there's an organization called the Law School Admission Council, LSAC, and they run just about everything to do with law school admissions. So if you are a prospective law school applicant, you're going to be giving LSAC a lot of your time and money. And that's because LSAC is basically like if you took the common application and College Board and combine them together into an organization. Because they run the LSAT and they run the application for every law school out there. So what's very cool about that is that they have an incredible amount of information that's very helpful to admissions. This is something that really only somebody who's worked on the admissions side would appreciate, but they also collate all the documents. So instead of the admissions office having to receive 1,000,001 recommendation letters and different, credentials and having to organize all of that into their systems, LSAC does that for law schools. And they just send you, once the application materials are there, they just send you a batch of PDFs and that's it. So it's pretty amazing to work at a law school after having, the worst file folder paper cuts in the world working in undergraduate admission back in the day. So it's a really well-running organization. And as an applicant, you're going to be completing your applications to law school, which again, the LSAC runs it all. And so it's sort of like Common App. You're filling out all of your major information once and then answering those school-specific questions. You do have a personal statement. You do have, typically colleges are going to require, or law schools are going to require 2 letters of recommendation. You'll also have to take standardized testing. And this is something that, one way in which I think there's a major departure from law school admissions as compared to undergraduate admissions is that the accrediting agency for law schools is called the American Bar Association. And it is a requirement that law schools use some kind of standardized test in their admissions process. So the whole test optional thing that happens, virtually everywhere, didn't happen in law schools. And what's funny is the way that was really dealt with, because, LSAC had a major problem on their hands with getting people access to taking that test, is that they converted the LSAT from being a paper and pencil test that you go to a test center to take, which test centers were oftentimes universities, to they made it digital. They made it an individually, virtually proctored exam. And they rolled it out like nobody's business.
Wow.
I mean, it was fast. And it definitely had its glitches and things like that, because they really had to staff up in a way that they never had before. But again, students were required to take an admissions test to be able to go to law school. So in order for that to happen, that's how they pivoted very quickly. And so they'd send devices and, internet connectivity hubs to students if they didn't have access to it. So they very quickly got very versed in a lot of great access work, I think. So I give them a lot of credit for doing that. But again, it is a requirement. So, you cannot be test optional and apply to law school. Now, one of the things that was perhaps accelerated in the pandemic, but was already happening within law school admissions, is being able to take the GRE, which is kind of a more general grad school test, more akin to the SAT, I would say, in terms of its content and format than the LSAT is. And so a lot of law schools got variances. They got permission from the American Bar Association to accept the GRE in place of the LSAT. And so that is much more commonly accepted now. One should know, though, that if you take the LSAT, you do have to report that score. And the reason why is because, again, you're applying through LSAC. So they have that score. So you can never not send a score. The law school is going to see it if you have taken it. But there is, there's a little bit of a wider avenue, I would say, to access now that the GRE is also taken. And another new thing that's actually coming down the pike now is that there's another law school test, which is came out of the University of Arizona, and it's called JD Next. And it's, instead of being like a standardized test on certain subjects and with certain content knowledge, it's much more trying to test on skills that you need to be a good lawyer and good law student. And so you actually kind of, I believe how it works is that you're taking a course on these JD skills, JD being Juris Doctor, that's the law school degree. And then at the end of this several weeks long course experience, you're taking this skills-based test. So that's the next kind of change that is coming around the corner with law school admissions. But again, that as long as that rule is there that you have to take a standardized test, that's always going to be part of the process. It's up to law schools, of course, how much emphasis they want to put on the LSAT or the GRE. But I would say that is one major difference, is that it's a holistic admissions process, but it is very strongly oriented toward test scores and your college GPA. So those are for sure the two biggest factors. But they are, they're reading your entire application. They're reading your personal statement. For me, coming from that undergraduate admissions training, I really valued that a lot. And I really, tried to develop a reading process at the law school where I worked, where those things were very valued. And interestingly, right before I arrived, and this continued as I was there, is that they would have interviews as part of the law school admissions at UMKC, which was very unusual at the time. More and more law schools started to pick up on it as law school applications. I also got to work in law school admissions right after this great recession. And so law school applications went way down. It was a really difficult time to work in law school admissions. And so interviews were a way also of kind of helping with yield and getting more students interested. So again, like a lot of similar components to what we see in the undergraduate admission process. One other, though, distinction for law schools and for grad schools generally is that the faculty is more involved in the admissions process. So, there were very few actual admissions folks at the law school where I worked. I was one of 3. But there were professors who read the applications, who did the interviews, who were part of the admissions committee. And so, every law school will design this a little bit differently, but do keep in mind that when you're applying to law school, yes, there are some admissions professionals who are, reading and handling your application, but there is a much stronger hand, I would say, of faculty who are involved in that. And they look at things a little bit differently. They're kind of lay people. I mean, all admissions people are lay people, but their main job is to be a law professor. They are lawyers and they are professors, and then they do this committee work on the side. And so you never quite know the kinds of things that they're going to pick up on, but that is your audience when you are applying to law school.
Great. So there's a few things I've heard, the role of the LSAC, the role faculty play in decisions, and the role test scores plays is kind of a way of getting around it. And it's kind of evolving a little bit. So that other JD test that you mentioned, are schools using that in addition to the LSAT, or is it in place of?
It is, I believe, potentially in place of the LSAT. Now, in order for a school to be able to utilize any new test, they have to apply for a variance. They have to show that their students, and how they do this is that they take a bunch of their current law school students and they make them take this test. And then they compare it to how those students did on their LSAT. And so they kind of backwards prove that, yes, this is a valid and reliable test that can be used. And so again, it takes a little while for all of this stuff to go through, and for lawyers, they do things in a lawyerly fashion. They have a lot of rules and regulations and I's to dot and T's to cross, but it's out there, and it's something, especially for students, if they're applying to undergrad right now, well gosh, by the time you are graduating and applying to law school, this could be a major alternative to the LSAT. But we have yet to see how. I mean, the LSAT's been around for years and years and years. It's been tested, proven. It's also trying to adapt more to today's testers. So starting next year, they've taken out one of the more notoriously difficult sections of the LSAT, which was logic games. And so, it's just as, the ACT and SAT are trying to adapt to the market and to trying to be as relevant as they can be. So is the LSAT, in part probably because they have a bit more competition that they didn't used to have before.
What would you say, Lydia, to someone who's listening, parent who's listening, has a student that wants to be an attorney? What would be your advice for them to make themselves the absolute strongest law school applicant they could be?
Yeah, well, one thing, one kind of myth that I would dispel quite a bit working in admissions and law school was that you don't have to major in any particular thing to be prepared for law school. Law school, in fact, they'll even tell you this during orientation, forget everything that you know or that you think you know about being a lawyer, because you don't know. And we're going to teach you how to do this. And so, sometimes people would think, oh, I should do criminal justice if I want to be a lawyer. Well, you can. But in fact, they might tell you that what you've learned is wrong and reteach you everything. So it's really important just to major in something that you like, something that is going to really challenge you. Just as undergraduate admissions is looking for a curriculum that is going to have challenged a student, that, something where you'll be able to be a good critical thinker and a close reader, that's what law schools are looking for too. And you can get that in biology. You can get that studying religion. You can get that studying a foreign language. It does not really matter. But you do want to challenge yourself, and you want to be able to have the academic record to show that. And law school admissions, they definitely care a lot about GPA, but they are like undergrad admissions. They're looking at it in context. And what is particularly fascinating about law school admissions is that, in undergrad admissions, we talk all the time about every school's transcript is different. And so you're looking at them within the context of the school, of the curriculum that's offered, of the grading scale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The same is true for law school admissions, but they have the facts in front of them because every single person who's ever applied to law school has done so through LSAC. So what they'll do is, let's say Let's say I graduated from, I'll just use myself as an example. I graduated from Haverford College in 2004. If I applied to law school today, not only would they have what my GPA at Haverford looks like compared to other students applying to law school from Haverford. So again, they're looking at you within the context of your specific school because they know what those GPA ranges are like. They are also comparing me to students who went to Haverford who graduated in 2003, 2004, 2005. So they're not looking at you compared to the students today. They're looking at you compared to students from your era, whenever that was. So it is very granular. It is, they get to see patterns. They get to develop them in a very real and direct way. What they can't do is they don't know, your major and how the GPAs might compare. But sometimes, and particularly at my college, we would talk about, oh gosh, we really don't have grade inflation. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But LSAC would be able to tell you for real whether there is grade inflation at your school and how you actually stack up. And so there were times, there are some schools where we would see, oh, this person's got a 4.0, but actually that puts them in the bottom 25th percentile because of how that school does grade inflation. So I think that that's very helpful, and that, they get very true information out of that. The other thing in thinking about who's reviewing those applications, the professors who read applications, they really like hearing from professors. So I would say when you're thinking about those recommendation letters, sometimes people think, oh, I've got to get a lawyer to recommend me. No, don't do that. Not to say that lawyers can't be great recommenders, but that's not what law school cares about. Law school cares how you're going to do in law school, the very next step in front of you. They're going to train you how to be a great lawyer. You don't need a lawyer to tell them that you have the skills to be a lawyer. They're going to be the judge of that once you get there. They want to hear how you've done academically, and they want to hear from those professors who have seen you day in, day out over the years, who have supervised your research, who, you've met with them outside of office hours. So again, like just how I give the advice to high school students, get to know your teachers. They're going to be your best advocates. The more they know you, the better they're going to be able to write about you. It's doubly true for law school. One thing I will add, though, is that sometimes I have students who were a few years out of undergrad, who had graduated a few years ago, took some time off before they wanted to go to grad school, and were worried that their professors may not know them. First of all, I would say still go and talk to them, because you might be surprised. You really might be surprised. And also, at that point, sure, it's fair game. If it's been a long time, have your employers write recommendations. If you know a lawyer, they might be able to write a good recommendation. But in as much as you can, it is incredibly helpful to have your recommendation letters come from professors, at least one of them.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, I recommended some time ago that you watch the Dream School documentary by PBS that appears on YouTube. And more than 15 people reached out to me to say how helpful that was. Well, I have another recommendation that's almost that good. Brennan Barnard interviewed Dr. Lisa D'Amour on the podcast he does with Rick Clark called The Truth About College, which, by the way, I think is the podcast that's most simpatico with our podcast when it comes to ethos and values and mission. And I really believe that this is an interview every one of our listeners needs to hear. It's only 30 minutes. You may remember we have featured Dr. Lisa D'Amour many times. In fact, 3 times we've had a recommended resource from Lisa D'Amour. A long time ago, we recommended her book, Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through 7 Transitions into Adulthood. On another recommended resource, we recommended her book, Under Pressure, Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls. And pretty recently, we recommended her newest book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, Raising Connected, Capable, and Compassionate Adolescents. In this interview with Brennan, she applies all of this wisdom to the college process. And she also reflects on her own student going through the process recently. So check out the Truth About College Admission podcast to hear standing interview. It's the most recent one they did. And I think I'd like her to come on our podcast after listening to her. So stay tuned.
I actually don't know the answer to this, Lydia, and I'm super curious because I hear a lot of chatter about this. But what role does the perceived prestige of the undergraduate school or the selectivity of the undergraduate school play in the admissions process in terms of the candidacy of an applicant for law school?
Yeah, and it's hard to give you any sort of exact answer on that. And in fact, when you're at law school, the most common answer to anything is it depends, and that's just a constant joke at law school. But it's true in this case as well. I think that law schools, just as undergraduate institutions are really looking to diversify where their students are coming from, law schools are doing a similar thing. And so it. Just because you went to a top, a fancy name, top whatever undergraduate institution, it's not necessarily giving you an edge for law school. It can be if that also has given you the right kind of preparation and access to research and resources and has been able to help you really expand your experiences and your critical thinking. But it's not the name of the school that's really doing the work. It is how you performed at that school, and it is the kinds of things that your professors have to say about you. And just as, undergraduate institutions have kind of, I don't want to call it a sliding scale, but they have different expectations for recommendation letters coming from schools that might only send 25% of their students to four-year undergraduate schools. So too do law schools. I mean, they read that same way as well. So it's okay if that recommendation letter isn't as polished, or if that recommendation letter is from a grad assistant, because that's who actually taught your class and that's actually who knows you. That's okay. It's really about the content and what they're able to glean from that and how they're going to picture you as a student at that school. So yeah, I don't think that there is a major bias. I do think that certainly, working at the school that I worked at, it was part of a larger university that also had an undergraduate population. So some law schools are standalone. Some law schools, there is no undergrad school connected to it, but many law schools do have an undergraduate institution also. So, sometimes they might have a little bit of preference for their own, but I would say that's more just in that they know the quality of the education of that undergraduate school. And some law schools do have, there's also a rule that gives some flexibility where they can do like a 6-year program where you can do 3 years of your undergraduate degree. If you've done all of your major requirements and just have electives, you can then go to law school to basically finish your undergraduate degree with your first year of law school. And in that way, you can do like a 3+3 kind of program. So there are some law schools that have those programs. My law school did have one of those programs, and sometimes there are a certain number of seats that could be reserved for students who are pursuing that kind of a program.
I have kind of a follow-up similar to what Julia's talking about, but also going back to this LSAC, which I'm finding very, very fascinating, by the way. So if this LSAC, Lydia would have known your GPA from undergrad and also like the 2003, 2005, like the 3 years and the cohorts before and after you, would they have evidence or documentation or statistics that show like a 3.5 GPA from Haverford? This is the kind of GPA that results in at various law schools in the country? Do they have that kind of data?
And what you're asking for is kind of reverse data, because they'd have to know from the undergrad or from the law school what your GPA ended up like. And the answer to that is yes, but I don't know that they share any of that information. So the other thing that was really neat, it's great for statistical nerds, is that what we could do, you would opt into it. but we did always opt into it, is you could send all of your students their 1L GPAs. That is to say, 1L means your first year of law school. It's a foundational year for GPAs. And so you could take that data, send it to LSAC. They would produce for you reports that would show exactly what you're talking about. And they would show, hey, for student, and they cared more about like LSAT scores with the GPA, not so much the institutional GPA, but just what that raw GPA was. And they would do correlation studies. They would help you if you were trying to reverse engineer some kind of formula for yourself to see, what is the prediction of how somebody with this LSAT score and this GPA, how would they do at my institution? So yeah, there's all kinds of engineering that goes on at that level. Again, it does not, for what law schools or what the LSAC shares with law schools, they don't give it to you by the undergraduate institution like what you're talking about, but they absolutely have that data. Yeah.
So does this mean, like, when you're reading, you've already said the LSAT plays a bigger role, it sounds like, than SAT, ACT did in undergraduate admissions. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that is fair to say.
So the testing plays a bigger role, and then they have this body of data on GPA and sort of some aspect of how it correlates to law school success. You have access to some of that. So did you feel like right away, just off the metrics, like a lot of people immediately just got ruled out right away just off that?
Kind of. You'd see those metrics, and you'd have this statistical front page, which would also give us, by the way, the percentile that you fell in, that your GPA fell into for your particular university. So I knew if somebody was in the 9th percentile versus the 90th percentile. So yes, based on that would certainly influence the rest of your read. If I was looking at a file with an LSAT score and a GPA that were well below our metrics and well below what we would consider for a student to be successful at our law school, then I was very skeptical reading the rest of the application. And we'd have to see, is there a reason for this low score or this low GPA? And sometimes there was a reason. And sometimes, especially after an interview, some of those things could be mitigated and maybe an offer of admission was made. However, yeah, generally speaking, those metrics would it was kind of like a pre-read. You'd have an idea of where this file is probably going to end up, and then it was up to the file to prove itself one way or another.
But you could argue that's true in undergrad too, right? Like really low GPA, yeah. Low test scores. Like, are you saying it's different, or are you saying it's similar?
I'm saying it's similar, but it's just much, much more telling with law school admissions. If I were to take to the admissions committee a file that, whose metrics were not in our regular range, I'd really have to prove that it was worth their time to look at. So, and the other thing that was getting very popular about the time that I was leaving law school admissions, because it was turning much more scientific, is that, you do predictive modeling for your class. And I'm sure undergraduate enrollment managers do this too, but it would do it to the degree of scholarshiping too. So there are a lot of outside companies that a law school could pay for to come in and say, here's all of our data. Here's, our 1L GPAs. Can you go through and make us kind of a little chart almost, to be able to tell us, how many people do we need to admit who have this LSAT score to be able to keep our LSAT median where it is. Now, of course, a lot of that is U.S. news and law schools needing to report their GPA and, more importantly, their LSAT range. And so, sometimes you were really looking at, oh gosh, if I want to keep this LSAT range where it is, I need to buy some more LSAT scores, meaning I need to spend some scholarship money in a wise way to try to keep this metric where I want it to be. Now, a couple of years ago, a bunch of law schools started revolting against the U.S. news. And enough of them did so that they did go and in fact change their formula, and they started putting much more emphasis on bar passage rates. So that's the big tests that you have to take after you graduate, standardized tests, state by state, to be able to be a licensed lawyer. So looking at bar passage rates and employment rates and putting more emphasis on those metrics rather than the incoming admissions metrics. But yeah, it can get very, very granular and very scientific very quickly when rankings are on the line and when money is on the line. So yeah, as much as and it certainly, I don't want to discount it. It certainly is a holistic admissions process, but it is not a holistic scholarship process, and there are some. Depending on the law school and depending on what they value and what their incoming first year class looks like, there's just certain numbers that you have to hit.
There's certainly a perception out there that going to a brand name undergrad greatly enhances your chances of going to a brand name law school. Like, how do you feel that's true? Do you feel that's not true? I mean, I know Julia asked that, but I'm just trying to come at it again because I know that's a constant question people have, and we hear it in counseling. I've got to go to here because I want to go to XYZ law school, and if I don't get in here, I won't get in XYZ law school. And so, it's a tricky question because nobody's saying all schools are equal, but just talk to me about it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. And I'll say, it's a little bit hard for me to comment upon because the law school where I worked was not as selective of a law school. I mean, it was about a 50% acceptance rate, which, law school in itself, it is a selective thing. Not everybody who applies to law school is going to get into law school. So that, definitely from the law school where I worked, I think the admissions committee was actually sometimes really impressed of, oh my gosh, somebody from this, school over way on the East Coast or West Coast with some big name wants to come to Kansas City, Missouri. Wow, that's pretty cool. But I mean, I think, again, I think for any law school, they really want to bring in that diverse class. And so, yeah, they're going to get a lot of applicants from, the biggest law school feeders that are out there, which are not always, I think, what people might expect. But there is a law school feeder list. I don't have access to that list anymore since I don't work for a law school. But they do publish, hey, here are the undergraduate institutions that are producing the most law school applicants. And, I think they're really just looking for good applicants. Yes, if they know a school really well and they know the quality of preparation, coming out of that particular program, of course that weighs. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to give a really good look at an application from a school that they aren't familiar with, if that applicant is really impressive. And that's one of the things I think for folks who are very protective of the LSAT, which I totally agree with, is that the LSAT, just as I think the SAT did back in the day, it really helped students from different backgrounds get a look at law schools who, weren't coming from the pedigree that maybe your typical law school applicant came from at that time, but they were able to show, hey, I can get the LSAT score. I can take this test. You need to consider me. And so the LSAT actually in its early days did a lot, I think, for diversifying law schools. So again, in some ways it's, you could go to that top name brand institution, but if you don't have the numbers to back it up, that is not going to help you at all. And in fact, maybe you would have been better off if you went someplace where you could do really well, And I wouldn't want a student to pick their undergrad school based solely on that, but I think that there's something to be said for being at an institution that is that right fit all the way around, that you're not going there just for a name, but you're going there because you know that they can educate you, that, you need to be a good consumer and think about where you're going to be able to be successful.
Friends, this completes the first half. Hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Okay, Kevin is back, and he's here to talk about the University of Edinburgh, which is another really popular university. It wasn't that long ago we had him doing a deep dive for us on St. Andrews. This is a much larger school. But in that, how far would Edinburgh be from St. Andrews, Kevin?
About an hour.
Yeah. So only an hour away, but a much larger school. It's about 170 years younger. What else can you tell us about Edinburgh?
I'm assuming you're talking about the university and not the city, but first of all,
correct.
The city is
well, you can talk about both, though. You can talk. People do like to know the context. So why don't you talk about both? That's actually important now that I think about it. Talk about the city and talk about the school.
Obviously, Edinburgh is the capital of Scotland, so you've got a ton of history there. It's not the largest city in Scotland, but the university itself is superb. And a lot of people tend to think of, they'll rattle off the Scottish universities, Glasgow, Edinburgh, St. Andrews. Eventually they'll get to Aberdeen and Dundee and others, but it's really easy because there's only that hour difference between St. Andrews and Edinburgh to lump them together, and you could not have two more different places when it comes to maybe not the approach of teaching and things like that, but certainly with the size of the university, the layout of the university. But there's still two of the absolute best institutions in the UK, and by a lot of rankings, just because of this skew towards more comprehensive research universities, Edinburgh is one of the top 25 universities in the world, and yet it's quite attainable for a lot of American applicants.
I'm assuming you've been there as well. What were your
Yes.
impressions?
I loved Edinburgh, but that said, it is an urban campus. And by campus, I mean a number of different campuses scattered throughout the city. I think the classic example is it reminds me a little bit of, say, NYU or GW, in that you can't always tell where the campus starts and ends. So if you want something more urban or more that blends in with Edinburgh's, shall we say, unique architectural heritage of being, one of the oldest cities in the UK, you're going to find it there. If you're looking for something that has quads and dedicated academic buildings and makes you feel that you're on a university, Edinburgh is not it. So Edinburgh definitely leans more towards that, even away from some other urban campuses we see in the UK, more towards maybe something more akin to the University of Amsterdam, where different parts of the university are spread across the city. So Edinburgh is not a massive city geographically. Population-wise, it's only around 300,000 or 400,000 for the city itself. So it's still, you're going to want to factor that in, depending on where you end up living, what you end up studying, and all of that there is not a single cohesive campus at Edinburgh.
Yeah, that's really important. I see just from what you've said already how it differs so significantly from St. Andrews. Campus setting, size. What about program strengths? Are there specific disciplines or areas of study where you're like, wow, if you're really interested in this is the place?
I think that in a lot of ways, Edinburgh is just it may not be the single best at any one thing, but it's just so good at so many things. So one that, I'm obviously drawn to is surprise, the history and foreign relations fields. It's quite good. But I think what really stands out at Edinburgh are really, actually, because I've had a student do this in the past 2 years, is the quality of the veterinarian school programs. If you want to be a vet, the University of Edinburgh is one of the best places in the world to go. And those vet degrees do transfer back to the United States quite easily. So it's recognized by the AVMA, I believe is the acronym. Yes, the American Veterinary Medical Association. And they're one of the absolute best vet schools in the world.
I wonder what that's like going there and then coming back here. I mean, is it similar in that, you have to do an undergrad before you go to vet school, or is it different?
No, if you want to jump right into vet school in the UK and a number of places in Australia, you can go straight in as an undergrad. So it's very similar to how they approach medicine in that regard. And the Edinburgh Medical School is quite good as well. But I think that the vet school is just superb.
The vet school that I've had interest in from students I've worked with overseas is RVC in the University of London. I don't know if you've ever find any interest in that, but
one of my students just got in there last week. So
yeah, one of mine got in there last week. They're looking at U.S. I'm not treading on your turf here,
no,
Kev.
You're fine.
They're looking at all U.S. schools except for that.
No, you're fine. No, it's there. I think if you were to look at the top 3 UK vet schools, it's Cambridge, because Cambridge has to be mentioned, RVC, and then the University of Edinburgh School.
I also hear good things about University of London too.
Yes.
For vets. Yeah. But yeah, I did know Edinburgh had a really good vet school. I wasn't quite sure how that worked though. So how many years would you be going to school to come out of vet?
But typically around 6 is what I tell students to plan for.
Mm-hmm. But you get admitted right into the vet school right out of high school. And so it's almost like, what do we have, like accelerated med programs here? Right.
But even faster.
Yeah.
And again, you can do the same for medical school as well. But it's one of the big shockers, and it's a whole conversation about medical school, because then you have to worry about specialties and residencies and things like that. But for someone who knows they want to be a vet, it makes a lot of sense to avoid having 2 years of either university or vet school to have to pay for, and you can be a vet much faster.
So let's talk about all the reasons that students would potentially consider Edinburgh. One, from what I'm hearing, would just be the culture of that whole area, the culture of the region, really probably liking the city, probably Scottish culture. And obviously you like being in the city, you like the action pulse energy of the city. Another could be the strength of the vet school. Another just could be that just overall the programs tend to be strong across the board. Anything else come to mind?
I think the big one for a lot of Americans is honestly how obtainable it is.
Mm-hmm.
So
talk to us about that a little more.
Mm-hmm. Oxford and Cambridge requiring a bunch of 5s on AP exams. Edinburgh doesn't. They're happy with 4s, or they're happy with a really solid GPA.
So let's talk about this. Let's say a student is taking a fairly standard curriculum. I say fairly standard. Let's say they have, it's hard to say what fairly standard is, because there's zillions and zillions of curriculums out there. And even when we get into APs, some schools offer like 25 and some offer like 8 or whatever, 6. But, let's say it's a student, they got to calculus. Let's say they got to Calc AB. And let's say they, took a few sciences. Maybe they only got to like third year in a foreign language. And let's say they're sort of like a, 3.6, 3.7 unweighted GPA. And let's say they kind of like half as many A's and B's, like they're kind of an A-B student, maybe one explainable C, but maybe it was like in 10th or something like that. Is a student like that? And let's say their test scores are like 1250, 1280 on a SAT. Is a student like that competitive?
So you're right at the edge of it.
Okay, that's that one's right on the cusp of maybe not. Cusp.
So to give you an idea, these are the minimum requirements for Edinburgh. This is not going to get you into the med school.
Sure.
But it will definitely, it's kind of what they say is this is what you should be applying with if you want serious consideration, is on the SAT or ACT, either a 27 or a 1290.
Okay.
They need a 3.3 weighted GPA. Or
that was weighted.
Or unweighted, excuse me. I'm sorry, I misspoke.
Yeah, so that's more B's than A's.
Right. And at least 2 AP scores of 4 or above. Now, if you don't have that ACT or SAT, you can sub in an additional AP of 4 and above, and they have to be relevant. So, your student who's, made it to Calc AB and probably took AP US history as a junior, assuming they're getting 4s, they're competitive. Now, again, it depends on what they want to study. If they're applying for biology or chemistry with an AP and calculus and an AP in history. If their high school does not happen to offer anything else, they can explain that and, point to getting A's in biology, chemistry, other traditional lab sciences. If they're applying for, say, math or English or even or history, they're more than likely going to be okay in that position. But if it's one of those things where they did have access to the APs and they just didn't take them, because something that UCAS has started to do is shift and ask in the letter of recommendation, tell me about the high school. Tell me what the accessibility of these advanced courses was. Because they've noticed, and this is something I think we've talked about before, the AP just isn't all it's cracked up to be. And they're starting to figure out that maybe not everyone wants to take the APs. Maybe a lot of high schools feel that they can teach to a higher standard if they're not having to worry about this exam at the end of the year. I know it's especially true with some students I work with in, say, the Bay Area or New York City. They're like, we don't have to worry about the AP anymore because, I'm in multivariable calculus and that's what I learned sophomore year or something like that. So they're starting to figure that out, that it doesn't matter as much, but it's the Scottish universities as a whole are doing a better job of this than, say, universities in the south of England, who still are very test happy.
Something I should have asked you about St. Andrews, so I'll really ask you now, about both schools. Obviously, we've talked about transcript. We know transcript's important. We know grades are important. We know courses you take are important. We know testing is important. And we know that for these schools, and we know even that there's a range of what's considered acceptable testing. And I want to come back to what you said about AP a little later. But while it's on my mind, for most of the selective schools, in the United States, there's a series of other things that are very important, right? So we're talking about things like all of the writing that the student has in the application, personal statement, custom college-specific questions. So that would be the writing. We're talking about recommendations, which could be teacher, counselor, and other. So a series of recommendations. And you have occasional schools that ask for a parent rec or a peer rec, but those are usually more one-offs. Then we have extracurriculars. We also have demonstrated interest, personal qualities, and things like unique institutional priorities. It could be something like legacy or ability to pay or just whatever the school needs in terms of, could be unique compositional diversity. They could want more Pell students or first gen or kids from Idaho or Wyoming or something like that. So these are all a bunch of other factors that the most selective schools take into consideration beyond just transcript, grades, rigor, grade trends, and testing. So I'm kind of asking to you about both of them, and maybe the answer is the same for both, or maybe it's different. But when it comes to those other things, essays, recs, extracurriculars, personal qualities, demonstrated interest, all those things, factored at all, not a factor, varies from one school to the other? Talk to me about that.
Absolutely. So assuming you're applying via UCAS, which in most cases is it's the only way to apply to Edinburgh. I think unless you are applying solely to Edinburgh, I would have to double check that.
See, I didn't even know that Edinburgh wasn't on the Common App, which I should know, but I didn't.
Let me double check that just to be sure.
Yeah, they're always adding schools. I looked the other day and I saw 1,075. Man, they just blew through that 1,000 number and they're about to blow through 1,100.
No, Edinburgh requires UCAS.
Okay.
So starting this year in 2024, the personal statement and the letter of recommendation have become more of a series of short answer questions. So they're debating whether or not they're going to do it with the personal statement. I've seen it's kind of ebbed and flowed, but I feel the writing's on the wall. They want to be able to increase, access would be the word I would use, to make sure that you're providing in your personal statement exactly what's relevant. So there are questions of, why do you want to study this? Why do you want to study, what makes you feel qualified to study this? What other activities have you done that relate to this?
Friends, this concludes the first part of Kevin Newton breaking down the University of Edinburgh. Edinburgh located in the capital of Scotland. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, I will share 4 takeaways from the SACAC conference. I will have a lot more than 4 I'll be sharing over a few weeks, but I'm going to chunk them out 4 at a time. Linda continues with part 2 of her excellent interview with Marjorie Bentley, the Senior Associate Director of Admissions at the University of Chicago and the Executive Director of the STARS Network. They continue discussing how 16 schools have bonded together to make it a priority to recruit more small town and rural students. STARS is an acronym that stands for Small Town and Rural Students. And friends, decisions will be out before you hear Monday's episode from pretty much every school. But I want to close by sharing a story from the late, great Peter Johnson. Peter is a legend in college admissions. He traveled around the country sharing this story. He was at Columbia for 35 years and was the director of undergraduate admissions before he passed away. Peter was a large man with a lot of girth. And here's what he used to say. Skinny suits are hot. Skinny suits are popular. Skinny suits have all the buzz. But then he would say, and he'd have his 2 hands, you can picture him pointing to his body. How do you think I would look in a skinny suit? Everybody laughs. Peter's not skinny. The point is, college is a match to and not a prize to be won. Remember that as decisions come out. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.